So good morning. In the last few days, a disturbing milestone has been passed on our way to a threatening climate future. The famous Keeling curve, which is on the front of our report here, which is generated from the monitoring atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations on Mount Mauna Loa in Hawaii, that curve has crossed the 400 part per million mark. Just 13 years ago, when I became Environmental Commissioner, it was 369 parts per million and rising at 1.6 per year. It rose 2.7 parts per million last year, and that annual rate continues to increase and accelerate. Now, at Cancun in 2010, world governments agreed that we must not let that concentration exceed 450 parts per million, lest the planet see an increase in global average temperature of greater than 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Now, that temperature is coincident with the maximum amount of climate disruption that is thought that our society and our economy can tolerate. Now, not all scientists agree with this. Some of the most prominent climate scientists say that 450 parts per million is too high, and that we must restructure our economy to achieve a long-term equilibrium condition of only 350 parts per million. Now, by law, I'm required to report each year to the legislature on the progress of the province of Ontario to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, such as CO2. So today I've tabled my latest report entitled Failing Our Future with the Speaker. It's based on greenhouse gas emissions reported by the federal government to the end of 2011. It is a short report which is reflective of the paucity of initiatives and progress to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions beyond the government's closure of the coal plants, which, although commendable, is now virtually complete. As in the past, the prognosis is bleak. There have been no improvements in emissions from the three biggest sectors, transportation, industry, and buildings, since the Climate Change Action Plan began in 2007. We've only a slim chance of meeting the government's 2014 target of 116 megatons, and no chance at all to meet the subsequent targets in 2020 and 2050 unless something markedly changes. In fact, because of the future planned nuclear retirement of Pickering and refurbishments at Darlington and Bruce nuclear stations, emissions of greenhouse gases from the electricity sector, which is the only area we've made progress, are expected to increase due to the substitution of natural gas-fired generation while the nuclear plants are down. On the graph behind me are three emission scenarios through 2032 forecast by the Ontario Power Authority. You can see that in the next few years, emissions are expected to continue to drop as coal disappears, and the new solar installations that are coming online next year shave the peak demands and reduce the need for natural gas peakers. Then around 2020, the nuclear plants start going offline, and natural gas-fired generation drives emissions up by perhaps as much as 17 megatons, higher than even the 14.8 megatons reported for 2011. After the nuclear capacity is restored, the emissions drop, but the natural gas-fired assets are still going to be in place, and they continue to represent an ongoing source of carbon emissions until their capital cost is amortized and their equipment is spent. It seems to me that there's a problem with this plan. First and foremost, the plan commits us to a natural gas generation future without factoring in a future price on carbon emissions. Most industrial companies use a shadow carbon price when doing economic projections for future projects, because the international community has signaled that there will be some sort of carbon regulation or taxation. So has the Government of Canada, and so has the Government of Ontario. Yet the same Ontario government does not cost a carbon price into its projections in the long-term energy plan. Thus, its plan is flawed. But most importantly, it must be noted that the period of time that we need the additional generation is only about 4 years, a short period of time on time scale. Natural gas infrastructure is good for about 20 years. So why are we building gas plants that are likely to become stranded assets and will continue to be greenhouse gas albatrosses for the next 2 decades? Given the great potential we have for electricity conservation in our system and the further potential for renewable generation, can we not draft a plan that allows us to meet demand during the refurbishment period with conservation initiatives so as not to incur the carbon liability? Apparently, the government is currently looking to update its long-term energy plan. I think it's long overdue to integrate this plan with its Climate Change Action Plan and get a price on carbon and get serious about greenhouse gas reduction.
Based on just your last point there, do you feel that our conservation initiatives would be enough to see us through that 4-year period you're talking about when nuclear capacity?
Yes, our view is that there's huge opportunity with things like demand response. We still haven't, we hear a lot about in the media about the surplus base generation, and yet the off-peak electricity price keeps going up. Why on earth, if the complaint is we're paying the Americans to take our off-peak excess generation, why are we charging consumers more and more for that off-peak power? There's just one example, but demand response, energy storage, we haven't scratched the surface of in Ontario. So, and then of course combined heat and power, we could use a lot of waste heat to displace a lot of gas consumption. There are opportunities in our system to conserve and to distribute generation and to use more renewables, and it seems to us it's more than enough to offset if we have a plan to do so.
Seen no interest from the government so far in moving forward with anything other than...
Well, no, because in fact we've got this disjoint situation. We've got Ontario government has a climate change action plan that says we're to reduce and have not as strict as I'd like to see, but nonetheless strict reductions in greenhouse gases. And then we have a long-term energy plan which is forecasting greater emissions of greenhouse gases. And the two are not coordinated. We don't cost the price of future carbon emissions into our long-term energy plan.
Do you have any idea whether conservation and increased reliance on renewables, would that be as cost-effective as the decision moving forward for...
Well, certainly gas plants, we've seen how cost-effective they are lately. It seems to me my colleague Ann Cavoukian is commenting on yet again this morning. So, yes, they're cost-effective because much of it is energy that's not utilized, not spent. We don't consume the energy. So there is no cheaper energy. We know this. I'm not making these numbers up. They come from Ontario Power Authority. The cheapest form of new generation is conservation. Last year, there's data for us, cost us 3 cents per kilowatt hour. There is no cheaper source of energy. Gas is much more than that. And plus we saw with mistakes it can add on top of it again. So yes, it is a cheaper way to go, but we haven't done the math. We haven't figured it out because we're not costing any price of carbon into our long-term energy plan, and neither are we really aggressively going after the conservation opportunities.
You mentioned it seems strange that the CCAP and the long-term energy plan would be kept in different silos. Has there been any response from the government about the natural progression of moving these two things together so that they're not...
No, it becomes a great mystery, and you can see the tremendous depth of interest in the media as before us. So yes, so there's an opportunity for a young and aggressive reporter to break into new fields that need to be discussed. Absolutely. I mean, I cannot in any way in my mind rationalize the fact that we don't cost carbon into our long-term energy pricing. As I say, most big corporations do, even in the absence of a carbon tax or any other kind of regulated cost of carbon, whether it be cap and trade or something. So, but they're doing it because they see that that's where the world is going, and you're foolish to plan 20 years in the future without taking the precaution of costing the price on carbon. Because what happens if you cost carbon 20 years in the future? There is no carbon tax? Well, you're just extra cautious. But if there is a carbon tax, you've made the correct decision in terms, and in terms of burning natural gas into the 2020s versus using conservation or other forms of inexpensive renewables, distributed renewables and storage and other things. We're not even considering that because there is no carbon cost.
Now you mentioned in the industry section of your report as well that the government in January of 2013 had put forward their third discussion paper about the possibility of talking with industry and stakeholders around like a cap and trade system, but yet it seems to be just another part of a rather lengthy conversation at this point over 5
Well, and the numbers are too small. I mean, a 5% reduction is simply too small a reduction to talk about. It doesn't. It's only what 2.5 megatons. It's a number far short of what they need to find to come anywhere close to meeting their targets. So if we're going to, I'm all for talking industry, and I certainly want to the consultation to occur. But let's talk about real numbers. Let's look at significant cuts and what would be involved. So at least. Even in the end, after a thorough public discussion, we have to reject those big cuts for very valid economic reasons. At least we had the discussion. But I think they're far too timid to go ahead with a 5%, a discussion based on 5% reduction in greenhouse gases.
Where would you like them to start in that conversation? What would be a good percentage starting point?
Well, let's look for big opportunities, and let's look for numbers like 25%.
I know you had also mentioned, back to electricity for a second, that some of the how accurate some of the reporting might be on greenhouse gas emissions for the gas plants when they don't include non-utility generation.
Yeah. Well, it's caught. The non-utility generation, the emissions are caught in the big numbers, so it's not as if we're losing them. We do catch them at, but it does distort the electricity picture somewhat to have them not included in the electricity number. And then, of course, the other big factor there is that, we hear about a lot about surplus base generation and the problems associated with that. Well, over 1,000 megatons megawatts, switching from tons to watts here, 1,000 megawatts of electrical production at night when we don't need it is from these non-utility generators, and these contracts allow them to run 24/7, and so they represent a distortion in the whole electricity markets, as well as a greenhouse gas issue, because they're not charged to the electricity portion of the accounts, if you like, but they are caught in the big number.
And switching to waste now, you also mentioned that number has stayed relatively flat over a number of years, but yet you also mentioned that a future report might take a look at the fact that, I believe it was like methane from landfill.
We actually have reported on that. Yeah, we have reported in past reports on this, the concern we have about calculating the methane number. Of course, methane is a much more powerful greenhouse gas, especially over the short term. And over the short term is where we have problems, right? They talk about 21 or 25 times the strength of CO2 over the 100-year period, but over the 20-year period, it's 72 times as strong a greenhouse gas as carbon dioxide. So, and of course, that's where we have the constraint in the near term, if you like, in these kind of issues. And our research shows that there's quite a body of evidence to suggest that the fugitive emissions, the extra losses of methane that are produced by you trying to recover methane to produce electricity from these landfill sites, has been tremendously underestimated. In fact, it could negate the benefit in some cases of if you burning methane that you capture for electricity, the sort of claimed carbon credit of that conversion from methane to CO2 when you burn it could be offset by the loss of methane from other aspects of the landfill, where it's just seeping out induced to seep out into the atmosphere. Now, my position in all my reports is that we can't do much. We can do only what we remedially with our existing landfills. But going forward, we've got to keep the organics out of landfills, so there is no methane production, or a very minimal methane production, and compost those organics and utilize them to enhance soil structure and, in fact, the sequestration of carbon in soil. So it's a different way of going. So we raise again the concern here that we have with those numbers, and they may be too low.
And finally, you also mentioned as well that the Ontario Building Code has now become one of the more progressive building and construction codes in North America. Is that one of the rare highlights in the report for you?
I guess.
Has actually taken some significant steps?
Absolutely. I mean, that was it was driven by energy, but energy converts, and certainly heat energy in our Ontario largely converts into natural gas not burnt, and so and that is a area we've made progress. We could make more progress in the building code if we didn't only review it every 5 years. If we took advantage of some of the new technologies that come out, it takes there's a long lead time to get the new technologies actually built into structures in Ontario, because the building code substantively is only reviewed every 5 years, where technologies, as you know, are coming out almost daily, all the time in this marvelous age we live in. So accelerating that would accelerate the number of opportunities we have to save in that building sector. And maybe the as-built sector, too, in terms of renovations, which, of course, is a big challenge for us.
I guess depending on how aggressive the government wants to be in terms of grandfathering some of these things.
Well, I mean, there's two things. I mean, there's the building codes applies to new structures, but as well we have, we used to have, quite an aggressive renovation program, a federal provincial program to subsidize people's renovations of buildings, and that actually is where your real low-hanging fruit, to use the expression, is, and your great opportunities are we have many hundreds of thousands of already built structures that have to be made more energy efficient and thus less greenhouse gas consumptive. And it's great that the brand new buildings are as energy efficient as they are, but that's just one aspect.
And were there any of the recommendations from your December 2012 report that you've seen any progress on from the government? And I know last time you were also critical of the electric vehicle subsidies and whatnot, that they weren't moving forward. Has there been any movement at all?
There's been no movement. This file is immensely quiet, and that's disturbing because there has, of course, been tremendous movement on the global scene and internationally, and tremendous recognition that and things are moving forward, even in the great United States of America, and even in the People's Republic of China, both of which have made major initiatives in the last year to either reduce and meet existing targets or new initiatives. But always quiet in Canada, and particularly quiet in Ontario. We have not seen any developments in the last reporting period. Thank you. Nothing to say? Okay. Thanks very much.